Chapter 1. Kinsey 2 years ago. Kinsey was running late as she wrestled her cello case into the house while waving bye to Lila and the other girls in her BFF's car. She wondered if her parents would even notice she was coming in later than usual but almost laughed aloud at the thought. They probably weren't even home. She lugged her case through the foyer and toward the stairs. She was poised to take the first step when she heard her father clear his throat behind her. She turned, positive he wouldn't even ask why she was late. Not that it was anything nefarious. They had simply decided to go for coffee after orchestra practice and lost track of time. Hey, she stiffened when she noticed her father had company. She tried to paste on a smile that felt wobbly but couldn't bring herself to quite look at him. Come join us for dinner, Kinsey. Her father gave her a smile that seemed as forced as her own. Is Mom home? She asked the question because it was expected, and she wanted to ascertain who was us, not because she cared to spend time with her mother. No, it's just us. This is an associate of mine, Kinsey. Ronan Cortland, meet Kinsey, my daughter. She's 18. Kinsey swallowed when Ronan moved closer, seeming to swallow all her space, though he only took a couple of steps. She plastered on a smile again and held out her hand. She expected a perfunctory shake, but he engulfed her palm with his, underscoring how large his hands were. The nails were neatly trimmed and buffed. The skin was mostly smooth, but with a rough patch here and there. She swore he held her hand so tightly for a moment that the whorls of his fingerprints imprinted into her skin. She breathed a sigh of relief when he let go. I have to practice. She nodded toward the cello. Dinner first, said Harvey in an insistent tone. I'm not really hungry. Her stomach rumbled, and she trailed off. She couldn't admit she didn't want to join her father and his guest because his guest unnerved her, so she forced another smile. Let me secure the cello, and I'll join you in a few minutes. Allow me to assist you. Before she could refuse, Ronan's lean fingers wrapped around the case and lifted it seemingly without effort. That shouldn't surprise her. Even in a handsomely tailored dark suit, she could see he had a large, muscular frame. For a moment, she imagined what he'd be like without a shirt before forcing her thoughts to veer quickly from that territory. You don't have to, Mr. Cortland. Call me Ronan, and it's a pleasure. He gestured with his free hand. Show me the way? She nodded, out of polite reasons to refuse, and bounded up the steps. She still wore the skirt that was part of her school uniform, and while it was modest, she had the paranoid fear he was seeing her panties with every step. Since they were demure white and plain cotton, they were hardly likely to even catch his attention, let alone drive him wild with lust. The thought of him being wild with lust made her shudder, and fear surged in her. She hastened her step and led him to the music room, where she usually kept her cello and practiced. You can set it here. After he'd done so, she said, thanks. He looked around the room. There are a lot of instruments. Do you play them all? She blinked and then shook her head. No, not at all. My mother collects them. She thinks they're sophisticated. She rolled her eyes. I just play cello. That's my instrument, though I can play guitar and violin. I've dabbled with the harp and mangled the ivories. He gave her a mysterious smile. I'd like to hear you play for me someday. Of course. It was a polite response and the expected one, but she couldn't fathom doing so. When she played, she opened herself to the music and poured her heart into it. It was akin to performing naked in an emotional sense. Being Ed in front of him held no appeal. Except her stomach tightened, and her breath hitched for a moment as she imagined it. She told herself it was just panic. I'm going to change before dinner. Do you remember the way back to the dining room? He nodded and left the music room without another word. Only then did she let out a ragged exhalation and draw in a cleansing breath. His scent lingered, and the mingled aroma of citrus and sandalwood burned into her olfactory memory. She would never forget that smell. It wasn't particularly unique, except for his own scent. That was what made it memorable. Realizing time was ticking away, she hurried to her bedroom to remove the uniform and don leggings and an oversized sweatshirt. It might be too warm for the shirt, but it felt like girding herself with armor. When she had no further excuse to avoid joining them, she left her room and returned downstairs. She heard their voices from the dining room and joined them. Ronan stood for her and pushed in her seat, treating her like she was a woman. She appreciated the gesture, but his hand brushed across the back of her neck, lingering a bit too long, and she tensed until he finally moved away. Consuela had made one of her signature dishes, and Kinsey almost moaned in delight to see the seafood Alfredo. It was one of her favorites, but Consuela rarely dared serve it when Celeste was home, since Celeste wouldn't touch carbs. Even worse, she made it a miserable experience if Kinsey dared have a serving. She worried about Kinsey's figure, but she could afford the occasional indulgence. She had a slender frame with nice curves, but she didn't have any trouble with keeping off excess pounds. Celeste probably just enjoyed having another reason to criticize her. "You're in school, Kinsey?" asked Ronan as he accepted a glass of wine from Harvey. She nodded, sipping her sparkling water. Not that she cared much about drinking. "At Harwood Academy." He nodded. "I believe that's quite exclusive." She shrugged a shoulder. "Maybe. I'm there for the arts program. That's all I know. Do you intend to play cello professionally?" "I do." She paused to enjoy a bite of crab melding perfectly with the Alfredo sauce. "I can't imagine anything more important or fulfilling. Perhaps you'll find something you love more." He suggested it lightly, but there was an unnerving intensity in his gaze. She managed to meet his gaze, drawing in a deep breath at the whiskey brown of his eyes, rimmed by a faint ring of brownish green. They were stunning and an unexpected contrast to his classically handsome features. Kinsey cleared her throat to refocus. "There's nothing more important to me." How could she explain the way playing lit her up inside and made her feel alive? How it blocked the hurts of having neglectful and uninterested parents. How everything made sense when she held the bow, which was so different from the kaleidoscope of her everyday life. He would never understand. "It's my passion." The simple explanation would suffice. He nodded. "I understand. Passions lead us, sometimes down the wrong path." He flashed a grin that seemed to be encouraging such a detour rather than warning her away from it. She sipped her water and avoided answering. She tried to fade into obscurity, but Ronan seemed determined to draw her into conversation. He was Harvey's guest, but it was like he was there just to see her. She managed to answer his questions and conquer some of her shyness by the time the meal concluded. "Would you get the dessert, Kinsey?" asked Harvey. "None for me," said Ronan. Kinsey looked at him. "You don't like sweet things?" His eyes sparkled, and there was an enigmatic expression she couldn't decipher. "I love sweet things, but they never stay sweet for long." "So, you don't bother with them?" He lifted a shoulder. "Only for the very special sweet." He was so cryptic. She shrugged. "I don't want dessert either. Should I get something for you, Dad?" Harvey waved a hand. "No, don't bother. Why don't you run along, Kinsey? We have business to discuss." Her father was sweating profusely, and he dabbed at his forehead with a fine linen napkin. She could imagine how Celeste would react to sweat on the expensive linen and stifled a grin. She got to her feet and headed toward the stairs. She was almost to them when Ronan put a hand on her shoulder. She froze, and her skin prickled where he touched her. Hesitantly, she turned her head to glance up at him. "Yes? It was nice to meet you. I look forward to seeing you again." There was more of a threat than a promise in his tone. She nodded as a shiver went down her spine. "Good night." She rushed up the stairs then, not caring if she appeared rude. She had to get away from him. He put her on edge and left her confused and afraid. She couldn't wait to escape him and put him out of her mind. So, it made no sense that she couldn't concentrate on her homework a bit later. She kept thinking about him, imagining his lean fingers. At first, she saw them moving tenderly over the strings of a cello, her cello. The wood morphed to flesh, and it was hers. She moaned and shook her head, trying to clear the thought. As she focused on the equation in front of her, she could feel his phantom fingers sliding up her back. She turned her head, honestly expecting someone to be there, but she was alone. It just felt so real. Something about him inspired explicit thoughts. She leaned back in her office chair, picturing him looming over her and pulling her back so he could kiss her. Their mouths would be upside down to each other, and she could feel his lower lip brushing against her nose as she closed her eyes. The kiss started out vague and tender, much like the couple she'd had in her life, but without the awkwardness or gross taste of someone else's tongue. Ronan kissed like a man who knew what he was doing, and the fantasy her appreciated that. "Sorry, folks, but please keep listening. YouTube makes content creators take out all the steamy stuff, but you can get the unabridged version free in ebook on all the vendors, or in audiobook on Google and Kobo. Instead, she just had the best orgasms of her life and was certain they were a pale substitute for how it would really be with Ronan. It doesn't matter. You'll never see him again. She muttered the words to her reflection in the mirror on her vanity table as she stood up to wash her hands. In the bathroom, she continued the conversation with herself. You're never doing that again. It was too much, too intense, too insane, and too unsettling.
Chapter 2. Ronan. She was pure perfection, with her orange-red hair that some would call carrot, or others might label strawberry blonde. It truly defied classification, and he couldn't wait to wrap it around his hands and feel its silken texture. Her hazel eyes were just as magnificent and as difficult to label, flashing between green and brown depending on the lighting and even her mood. He couldn't wait to see them leaking tears as pain contorted her delicate features. Her skin was perhaps the most perfect part of her. Pale and creamy, with not even a single freckle that he could see, it was going to beautifully hold bruises. He would be able to see his marks on her for days after each time he used her body. He could barely contain the need to shove away from the table and follow her upstairs. He just wanted to mark her once, to see if her skin revealed and retained the stories of pain he intended to carve into it as beautifully as he anticipated. He eyed Harvey coldly, determining the piece of crap wouldn't stop him if he decided to do just that. He could Kinsey in the next 5 minutes without a peep from her father. You're a piece of work, Winthrop. What kind of father sells his daughter to pay his debts? Harvey was sweating and dabbed at his forehead. I have no choice. It's you or the Russians, Cortland. Will you accept my deal, or should I offer her to Morova? Ronan let him stew for a moment, though he decided from the moment he saw Kinsey. She was perfection, and it was his desire to debase and destroy that. Yes, collect her. Harvey looked nonplussed. Surely not yet? He leaned forward across the table to scowl at Harvey, who trembled. And why not? She has a couple of weeks until she graduates from Harwood, and she's a gifted musician. She's been accepted at the Wilman Conservatory. If you could let her study for just a while first, let her have a normal life. She's still a child in many ways. Ronan shrugged. She's 18, unless you lied to me? At Harvey's frantic shake of his head, he shrugged again. Then she isn't a child. Please, Mr. Cortland, give her just a bit more time. He hesitated, imagining how satisfying it would be to play dark and twisted games with his new toy, and how much more gratifying it would be to wait, to deny himself the pleasure and inflict a bit of self-torture as he tested his will to see how long he could hold out before claiming her. Without giving an answer, he asked, Is she pure? Harvey trembled slightly as though realizing exactly what Ronan would do to his daughter. In the end, he must have decided it was still a viable option to sell her instead of protecting her. I think so. The housekeeper says she rarely goes out with anyone besides friends. Ronan curled his lip in disgust that Harvey had to consult the housekeeper rather than having a clue about what his daughter was doing, and with whom. As distant as his father and stepmother had been, at least Gianna and James had kept tabs on where he was. Hard not to when they'd shipped him off to a boarding school with an intensive therapy program. She must remain so, or the deal is off. As he said it, Ronan wasn't certain he meant it. He wanted to take her innocence and chip away at it until it was completely destroyed, but would he really give up the chance to break her if she wasn't pure? No, but the one who stole his treasure would pay. He'd break such a man in every way possible and make him suffer for it. He could well imagine what kind of inspiration that would generate to create his art, but he'd derive far more stimulation for his muse from breaking Kinsey. Fine. I'll give her more time. I'm not committing to how long, but I agree to let her finish high school first and perhaps some college. He sat back, his gaze daring Harvey to look away. Just we're clear, Winthrop, that when I take her, she belongs to me. Her sole purpose and only reason for existence is to please and serve me. When I'm done with her, I might return her to you, if she's capable of living a normal life. I will break her into pieces and reassemble her into what I want her to be. So, the question is, do you still want to offer this deal? Harvey licked his lips and dabbed his forehead again. You won't hurt her, will you? He couldn't hold back a laugh. I'll hurt her in many and varied ways. I will ruin her, and I'll feel cheated if I discover you allowed someone else to take my treasure first. She'll be utterly debased and destroyed. Do we have a deal? He held his breath, realizing he was more vested in Harvey's response than he'd expected. After all, Kinsey was still only a toy at the end of the day. There were a million others to pick up and discard if he didn't get to play with her. And yet, he was on the edge of his seat, figuratively and literally, as he awaited Harvey's answer. It was Harvey's last chance to be a decent human being and do the right thing for his daughter, and Ronan recognized there was a risk that Harvey might summon a shred of humanity after he'd been so honest about his intentions. "Yes, we have a deal." Ronan didn't bother to hide a snort of disgust. "I want access to your security cameras in the house, and I'll send a technician to install cameras in her bedroom and bathroom." "You can't do that. This is our private residence. You can't expect us to accept you watching everything." He shook his head. "Don't flatter yourself, Harvey. I have no interest in watching you or Celeste. I want unfettered access to Kinsey. I won't take her yet, but I'll watch her. That's all you need to know." Still, his chin wobbled, and his shoulders slumped. "Very well, I'll get you the access codes. Be sure my technician is allowed to complete the job when he arrives tomorrow." Ronan glanced at his watch, discovering he still had plenty of time to stop by Exquisite Agony, in spite of an early meeting. A visit to the discreet club hadn't been on his agenda for the evening, but he needed sexual release after seeing Kinsey and didn't want to bother with hunting another toy when he was sure to find a willing one at the club. "Thank you, Mr. Cortland." Ronan didn't bother to reply or acknowledge Harvey's words. He was too disgusted by the greed and selfishness the other man had shown to bother with niceties, not that he typically bothered with them anyway. The rules and expectations of society meant little to him. He could blend in and was a master of camouflage, but he was far enough removed from it all to realize how stupid all the games that people insisted on playing with each other were. He left the large home Winthrop had bought in better days a couple of moments later. He stood in the driveway, staring up and trying to determine which room was Kinsey's. His staring paid off when he saw a curtain flick and caught a glimpse of her glorious hair as she moved away. Had she been looking for him, and if so, was she trying to get another glimpse, or was she anxious to know when he departed? As he moved to his waiting car, he suspected it was the latter. He tried to hide the predator inside but knew it had emerged more than once. If she were smart, she would listen to her instincts and steer clear of him. It wouldn't save her in the end though. She was a skittish rabbit, and he would pluck her from wherever she tried to hide, because she was his now. In the car, he directed Conrad, his driver, assistant, and personal bodyguard, to take him to the club. Then he leaned back and imagined how stunning Kinsey would be when she was stripped bare. He didn't mean just clothing. When every last defense, pretense, and artifice had been demolished, how would she look? Anguished, raw, and real. He shivered with delight to imagine it. By the time they reached Exquisite Agony, he was aching for release. He used the back entrance, and no one asked him for proof of membership. No doubt the security people recognized him. He strode into the main floor, approaching the bar to order a neat whiskey while eyeing the women arranged on the platform nearby. They were all unclaimed and ready to play. He looked for one wearing a green bracelet, which indicated she would do anything. He found a few, but none appealed to him. It was a young woman wearing a yellow bracelet who caught his attention. Her hair was red, though the wrong shade. It was a rich auburn and probably from a bottle, but it was similar length. Her body style was also comparable, and she was about the same height. He caught her eye and gestured her to come to him. She approached with an eager air and bowed. "Yes, sir, let's play." He tossed back the rest of his whiskey and grabbed the wrist holding the yellow bracelet to pull her with him down the hall and into a free room. He picked one that wasn't open to viewing by other members, not wanting to indulge voyeurs this evening. "How may I serve you?" He didn't answer other than to gesture for her to go to the spanking bench. She did so with only a hint of anxiety. He selected a supple whip with thick strands before moving closer. She was in position, and the globes of her ass were pale and luscious. He preferred not to see her face. It would be easier to pretend she was Kinsey that way. "My name is Kinsey," he said firmly. When she glanced over her shoulder, looking uncertain, his stern gaze dared her to argue. She nodded. "Yes, sir. May I have a safe word?" He smiled, but it held no amusement. "You wear a yellow bracelet, which means you accept risk-aware consensual kink and sometimes without a safe word." "I don't do safe words, Kinsey." Her lips trembled, but she turned away and bent her head in a submissive pose. She was clearly bracing herself but still let out a startled gasp. Censored for YouTube. How long would he be able to deny himself before he had to claim Kinsey? If she left him in this state after an hour in her presence, how long would she amuse him and keep his attention? He shuddered with delight at the thought of having months to break her. He usually lost interest before then and finished the process rapidly when he reached the point of boredom. Censored for YouTube. He was done for now, and it had proved only moderately satisfactory. As he cleaned up in the adjacent bathroom, he speculated that he would have this unfulfilled ache inside until he claimed Kinsey and beautifully broke her. The question was, how long could he enjoy the suffering before he gave in and took her? It was a game he played with himself, but he would be the winner. The only loser in this.
Chapter 3. Kinsey. The party was in full swing, but Kinsey wasn't really enjoying herself. Lila, who'd clearly had too much to drink to be acting so uninhibitedly, was dancing on the antique Queen Anne table Celeste had purchased in France, and her mother would freak out if something happened to it, but she couldn't focus enough to ask her BFF to stop. Her head spun, and she felt nauseated. Fresh air. That would help. She moved through the people, marveling at how many from her academy had managed to cram into the house. It was large, but perhaps not large enough to accommodate this many. People had to have brought guests from other grades, and perhaps other schools, to the graduation party she and Lila were co-hosting. Her head hurt too much to care or think about kicking out people. Instead, she slipped through the crowd and outside, going to the patio. She angled a chair so it was in the shadow of the house, keeping the porch light from shining into her eyes. She closed her lids and breathed deeply, trying to push past whatever made her feel ill. A furtive scraping caught her attention, and her eyes snapped open. Well, they fluttered upward slowly since her body seemed apathetic about obeying her mental commands. Chris Dimitrov and Adam Watts now shared her space, but they weren't looking at her. They were whispering quietly and giggling. Abruptly, Kinsey recalled leaving her drink unattended when Lila had dragged her onto the makeshift dance floor to bump and grind with two guys she didn't even know. She had retrieved her drink from the end table when they were done dancing and finished it without a second thought. Had someone drugged her? It made sense and fit with how she was feeling. Eyeing the sneaky way Chris and Adam were creeping around her left her little doubt they were the perpetrators if someone had roofied her. She opened her mouth to tell them to go away, but only a squeak emerged. Chris approached first, with Adam hanging back more cautiously. She lifted a hand to stop him when he leaned down and started tugging at her skirt, trying to slide it up her legs. Censored. They were going to anyway since she couldn't fight back or even muster much of a protest beyond a few feeble utterances of, no, that they had so far ignored. She grayed out despite her best efforts. Kinsey's eyes blinked open when she heard a pained grunt, and she saw Adam dropping to the ground but couldn't figure out why. Then she heard cursing and glanced in the direction she heard it. A body flew through the air, and she realized it was Chris as his head collided with the stone facade on the outside wall with a sickening crunch. He slumped to the ground, and his head was at an odd angle. Is he dead? She was definitely thinking the question but suspected her words came out garbled instead. Her rescuer didn't answer, but she gasped when he turned to face her, and she recognized him as the man her father had hosted for dinner, who still featured in some of her fantasies despite her resolve not to let his face creep in, or his presence take over. In the throes of passion, he became her imaginary lover far too often for comfort. The party's breaking up. That came from another man who appeared beside Ronan. He was a few years younger, with light brown hair and an impassive face when he glanced at her. Avert your eyes, snapped Ronan as he strode over to drape the remnants of her blouse across her. How did you get rid of them? I pretended to be a neighbor who called the cops. The kids are scattering. Thanks. Ronan bent over her, and he was clearly talking to her now. Let's get you to bed. She shuddered, not sure from fright or anticipation, as he picked her up and carried her inside. She thought she clung to him but couldn't be sure her arms were functioning enough to actually do so. What if she talks? Asked the man whose name she didn't know. She probably won't remember anything about this. Those put so much in her drink that they're lucky they didn't kill her with an overdose. That confirmed she'd been drugged, but how did Ronan know, and why was he there? She opened her mouth to ask but couldn't get her tongue to cooperate. Ronan seemed to know exactly which room was hers. He carried her inside and closed the door behind him, leaving the other man in the hallway. He quickly stripped off her clothes with an air of efficiency that didn't intimidate her much. After he'd helped her into a nightshirt, he placed her on the bed and covered her. No more parties, my sweet. Focus on your music while you have a chance. He bent his head to kiss her forehead after tucking her in. Kinsey couldn't explain why she did it, but instinct urged her to tip up her chin as his mouth moved away. She licked her lips and looked at him through blurred eyes. With a small groan of surrender, his lips molded to hers, sending heat spiraling through her and almost jolting her back to awareness. The kiss ended before she could find her way through the fog, but she held onto his hand for a moment. Soon, pet. The words were ominous and sent a chill of fright through her even as they also provided an unnerving sense of warmth and protection. She didn't really want this man, did she? He was dangerous. Everything about him told her that. Her instincts were screaming at her to run away from him as fast as she could. Yet, she was compelled to rush toward him instead. It had to be the influence of whatever the boys had slipped her. Yes, she had fantasies of him, but reality was something else, something far more intimidating. Only a fool would get involved with a man like Ronan, and she wasn't a fool. Was she? She wished she could be more confident in that conclusion, but she was too dazed to think about much of anything. She couldn't analyze her reaction. Chapter 4. Kinsey. She woke the next morning with a headache and no memory of how she'd gotten to bed. She groaned as she sat up, reaching for her phone to text Lila, who had already sent half a dozen messages. Her eyes widened when she read Lila's frantic attempts to reach her and ask if the cops had been a pain. She dispensed with texting to call her friend. What cops? She asked as soon as Lila answered. The ones your neighbor called. Everyone scattered. Lila sighed. I'm sorry, Kinsey. I should have stayed behind and faced the music with you. I don't know if there was any music to face. I don't remember seeing the cops. I just woke up, and I don't really remember anything. She recalled party planning with Lila earlier in the afternoon and buying snacks and decorations, but the night itself was a blur. What happened to me? I don't know. I think I got kind of drunk. Lila sounded ashamed. It's okay. I guess everything went okay. She winced as she scooted out of bed when a pain shot through her lower region. Did I sleep with someone? You? Lila laughed. I doubt it. I had a heck of a time getting you to dance with those guys. They're the only ones I saw you with last night, and they never left my sight. I didn't think so. I'm just sore. She trailed off. I don't know. Maybe I fell down while blind drunk. I guess I should go because I'm probably in trouble. I don't remember cleaning up a thing. Good luck with the Ice Queen and Private Wimpy. Kinsey should probably admonish her friend for the unflattering nicknames she'd bestowed upon Celeste and Harvey but didn't bother. They were apt descriptors and made her grin each time Lila called them that. I'll see you later. She hurried to shower and prepared herself to face Celeste's wrath as she walked downstairs a bit later. She expected to see a messy living room, but it was spotless. She had a pang of guilt as she imagined her mother making Consuela clean up the remnants of Kinsey's party. She found them in the dining room, and the food made her stomach rumble. She sat down to join them, expecting a lecture. Neither of them looked up from their phones to even nod at her as she helped herself to the various items Consuela had served for brunch. How was your party? Asked her father a few bites later, but without much interest. It was fine. She frowned, waiting for them to scold her for leaving a mess. Celeste had spent months and an obscene amount of money to decorate to her liking less than a year ago, which was less than a year since her previous renovation. You didn't sleep with anyone, did you? Asked Celeste bluntly. Mother. She glanced at her father in discomfort, but he seemed to be listening avidly for the answer too. I didn't, but do you have to ask me that every time I leave the house, or host a party? Celeste shrugged. Your continued purity is important. It's too valuable to throw away on some random boy at a party. She managed not to roll her eyes. Yes, Mom. After that, they ate in silence, and she escaped with the claim of homework. Neither one said a thing, and she doubted they even realized she was done with school, having graduated Friday, an event neither had attended, and would have no homework until she started her first semester in college. She went to the music room to pick up her cello. She had no definite music in mind, but her bow soon plucked a melancholy song from the strings. She didn't know if she'd heard it somewhere before, or if it was an original composition. Normally, she would try to record it if she was composing, but this time, she went with the flow. She was so caught up in the music that she didn't hear anyone calling her. It wasn't until the door banged open, and Celeste appeared with 2 police officers, that she realized her mother had been trying to get her attention. "I'm sorry. I didn't hear you calling." "No wonder." Celeste gave the cops an exasperated look. "Here she is." Without another word, she took off. Kinsey clung tightly to her bow as anxiety crept over her. Recalling one of the neighbors had called about the party, she assumed they were here because of a noise complaint or something. She was 18 now, so was she going to have to face the consequences alone? Her mother had left without caring she was alone with 2 officers. "Are you here because of the party?" The female officer tucked her thumbs in her duty belt, which drew attention to her sidearm. "Did you see Chris Dimitrov or Adam Watts at your party last night?" She frowned as her stomach clenched with anxiety, though she had no idea why. "I think they were both here. Neither came home." She frowned. "Isn't it too soon to file a missing person report, since they're 18? Law and order." Guessed the handsome male cop, who was only a few years older than her. "Criminal Minds," she admitted sheepishly. "There are special circumstances where we investigate earlier than 72 hours. Kinsey could imagine those circumstances included coming from wealthy families. "I don't know them very well, but they're probably just out celebrating our graduation." The male cop nodded. The female cop scowled. "Their mothers are worried about them." That caused a pang of envy to make her chest tight, but she managed a smile. "I don't remember seeing them leave." She flinched as an image of Chris flying through the air flashed through her mind, but she couldn't coax any further detail when she focused on it. "Miss Winthrop?" asked the man with a hint of impatience, suggesting he'd been trying to get her attention for a bit. She blinked. "I'm sorry. I didn't sleep well last night." In reality, she didn't remember sleeping or waking up at all throughout the night. "Did you see anything helpful?" asked the woman. Kinsey almost mentioned the flash she'd gotten but couldn't be sure if it was imagination or memory. She leaned toward imagination since she couldn't remember much of anything about the party. "I don't think so. I'm sorry. I'm sure they'll come home soon. They're probably just jerking around somewhere," said the man. "Language and professionalism, Phelps," snapped the woman. She nodded at Kinsey. "Thanks for your time. If you think of anything, call us." She looked expectantly at Phelps, who passed Kinsey a card. "Day or night?" "I will." She tucked the card in her pocket and watched them leave. She was unsettled by their visit but didn't have anything helpful to contribute. Slowly, her bow returned to the strings, and she resumed playing the tune in her head. As she immersed herself in the music, she suddenly remembered Ronan's face looming over hers. No, it hadn't been looming. It had been tender. That certainly couldn't be a memory, and she must have indulged in one of her wild fantasies before passing out to sleep. She vowed she'd be far more judicious with her alcohol intake in the future as she resumed playing, soon forgetting all about Chris and Adam. Ronan wasn't so easily dismissed, and he lingered in the